Jalen Hurts, a 4-star recruit out of Channelview High School in Channelview, Texas, an Elite 11 finalist. He got the Alabama starting job as a true freshman. Everything was looking up, until it wasn't. We start our journey back in the state of Texas. A young Jalen Hurts would throw for 2,384 yards and 26 touchdowns, with 1,391 rushing yards and 25 rushing touchdowns as a junior. His talents took him to the Elite 11 finals, and he'd finish his career with a 95.247 rating, good enough to be ranked a top 10 quarterback in the country, and was headed to Tuscaloosa, Alabama to join the defending national champion Alabama Crimson Tide and Nick Saban. As we enter his freshman season, most people don't remember, but Blake Barnett was the day one starting quarterback, and their first test of the year would be against the USC Trojans in a neutral site game at AT&T Stadium, Jalen Hurts' home state. Now let's not forget, Blake Barnett was the truth coming out of high school in 2015. According to 247 Sports, he was the number 2 rated quarterback in the country with a .9898 composite rating, the highest quarterback recruit Nick Saban had ever signed at the time. And with the year to sit behind and watch Jake Coker lead the Tide to a national championship, the future at the quarterback position for Alabama seemed bright. And then it all fell down for Barnett on that opening night in Arlington, Texas. USC went down the field and got a field goal on their opening drive. Alabama followed it up with a 4-and-out after a good run on first down. USC then turned it over on downs after a nice 10-play drive. And Barnett would follow it with a 3-and-out. And that was enough for Nick Saban to see. After just 2 drives, the highly touted Blake Barnett was pulled for Jalen Hurts. Now Jalen Hurts will enter his first ever college football game in his home state versus the USC Trojans, and his first moments would result in a lost fumble on the very first play of the drive. But Saban would stick with Jalen Hurts even after the fumble, and things were slow for a while, but the vaunted 2016 Alabama defense would keep USC out the end zone the entire night, allowing just 6 points. So finally in the second quarter, Alabama would find the end zone on a 3-play drive with Jalen Hurts finding Undesirable Stewart for 39 yards. The score would be 17-3 at half thanks to a pick 6 thrown by USC's highly touted 5-star recruit Max Brown. Clay Helton, just like Saban, would also bench his quarterback in this game. This time it'd be Sam Darnold coming in for Max Brown. In the second half, it was basically a spring practice for Alabama. They found their stride with Hurts scoring 21 points in the third quarter. That quarter also included Hurts' first career interception. Once Alabama built a comfortable 38-6 lead, Blake Barnett would re-enter the game for mop-up duty. Also, third-string quarterback Cooper Bateman would get snaps in Alabama's dominating 52-6 win. Hurts finished the game with only 6 completions, but those 6 completions went for 118 yards and 2 touchdowns to 1 interception. He'd also run for 2 touchdowns and 32 yards, so the dual threat ability of Jalen Hurts was more than enough to rout the Trojans. Barnett went 5 for 6 for 100 yards and 1 touchdown, accompanied by -10 rushing yards. So is there a quarterback controversy or not in Tuscaloosa? Well, Nick Saban would say, "I made a decision for this game that whatever we did at quarterback was for now. We made a decision today for now. That's the only decision we made, so I'm not speculating on what we're going to do in the future." But we did find out more about the quarterback position going into the USC game after the dust settled in Arlington. Saban never even revealed who was taking the first snap against USC until redshirt freshman Blake Barnett went out for the opening series, where he became the youngest starter Saban had ever used at Alabama. Saban went even younger when, as he had planned, Hurts got into the game on the third series. Saban also said, "We think both guys are talented and we wanted both guys to play in the game." Saban said, "When the first quarter was over, I was wondering to myself, was this a good plan or a bad plan? Both guys were a little shaky in the beginning." So it seemed maybe both quarterbacks would play in their next game, which was the home opener against Western Kentucky. Which did happen, but in more of a 90-10 split. Hurts started the game and had Bama up 17-3 with a little over 3 minutes left in the first half. And that's where Barnett would come into the game. He had 2 drives back-to-back, both drives ended in punts, and Barnett did have a 52-yard completion in the midst of all this to Undesirable Stewart. But after the back-to-back punts, it was Jalen Hurts the rest of the way en route to a 38-10 victory in the home opener. And obviously Western Kentucky's defense isn't on the level of USC's, but Saban took the safety tools off and let Hurts sling the ball around the yard this game. Hurts threw 36 passes this game compared to the 11 attempts versus USC, and he completed 23 of those passes for 287 yards and 2 touchdowns to 0 interceptions. So now it's time for the SEC opener, and it was against the same Ole Miss Rebels who had beaten them the last 2 years. And Saban knew he'd need his team's A game for this one, So he fully ditched the dual quarterback system and Hurts would play every snap. And Saban's patience with Hurts was tested early on. They'd fall down 7-0, 10-3, 17-3, and 24-3. Right out the gate, the Tide's kryptonite had built a 21-point lead, and Hurts was missing early. He overthrew what would have been a wide open touchdown, and then fumbled on the play that gave Ole Miss the 24-3 lead. But again, Saban was patient with him and let him stay in the game. And then boom, Alabama played team football. Calvin Ridley got Alabama in the end zone for the first time today, and then Eddie Jackson followed it with a 85-yard touchdown return after a 3-and-out. And just like that, it was 24-17 at halftime. At this point, Ole Miss had already thrown their best punch. Ryan Anderson forced a fumble, which was returned for 6, and the game was tied. And then Alabama ran up the score to take a 41-30 lead, and then a 48-37 lead before a late Ole Miss touchdown to make the final score 48-43. Yet again, these two teams played a classic. Hurts was 19 for 31 for 158 yards and 0 touchdowns to 0 interceptions, but he played every snap and relied on his teammates when things got tough. Hurts also had 18 rushes for 146 yards, which was pivotal in the win. I'm not quite sure why Barnett didn't get any snaps after the 24-3 deficit, seeing Saban made a quarterback change versus USC after just 7 offensive plays, but I'm guessing Hurts' rushing ability is what made the difference and earned him the job. Alabama would then go on to throttle Kent State 48-0, with Hurts having 164 passing yards and 54 rushing yards for 2 total touchdowns. And simultaneously, Blake Barnett would withdraw from Alabama and basically enter the transfer portal. But him withdrawing when he did was a loophole that allowed him to not have to sit out for a year. So now with Barnett gone from the program, it was officially Jalen Hurts' team, no questions asked. After that was a 34-6 victory over Kentucky, with Hurts throwing for 262 yards and 2 touchdowns. And now it was Cooper Bateman taking the garbage time snaps. And then it was time for the absolute toughest stretch of the season. Alabama would have 4 straight ranked matchups. Number 16 Arkansas in Fayetteville, 9th ranked Tennessee in Knoxville, number 6 Texas A&M, and then to close it out, number 13 LSU in Death Valley. What an absolute monster stretch for the Tide. But versus Tennessee, they just made it look easy. Jalen Hurts threw for 172 yards and 1 touchdown to 1 interception, along with his 132 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns to lift the Tide to an emphatic 49-10 win. And the game plan was obvious by now. Use Hurts' rushing ability to bend defenses and rely on your elite defense to shut teams down. And that was working so far. Next up was Arkansas, and this time the passing game was rolling. Hurts went 13 for 17 for 253 yards and 2 touchdowns to 1 interception. And that was enough to build a 42-17 lead in the third quarter before a couple of late scores finalized the game at 49-30. Now 2-0 in this stretch, the Tide would be facing 6th ranked Texas A&M. And once again, this team just proved to be too good. Bama had built a 13-0 lead after Hurts' 5-yard touchdown pass, but A&M would find the end zone for their first score, making it 13-7 at half after a Hurts interception on a prayer before halftime. And then it looked like we had a game, as A&M scored first coming out of half to take a 14-13 lead. And then Bama would just find their stride. Calvin Ridley caught a touchdown, Jonathan Allen returned a fumble for 6, and then Hurts ran it in from 37 yards out. Alabama scored the last 20 points of the game as they convincingly won 33-14. Hurts threw for 164 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions while running for 93 yards and a score. And now the final test of their 4-game stretch, Death Valley at night. And for those who remember, the headline of this game the year before was Derrick Henry versus Leonard Fournette. And Fournette would be stuffed at the line of scrimmage all night, running for just 31 yards while Henry rushed for 210 yards and 3 touchdowns. Well, this year, Mr. Henry was gone, and Fournette was still here. And now they were back and in Baton Rouge. It was the perfect storm for a revenge game. And then, literally the same exact thing happened. This was literally 2011 LSU Alabama Game of the Century 2.0. 2 elite defenses collided, and after 3, the score was still 0-0. Alabama's first drive of the game had been intercepted just 2 plays in. After that, the 2 teams would trade punts, fumble, and as signature in this rivalry, miss field goals. To set the scene, with 5:50 to go in the third quarter, Jalen Hurts had been strip sacked, giving the ball to LSU in Alabama territory. But once again, the vaunted Alabama defense forced a stop, and the Tide had yet another chance to get the first score. On the drive before, right before the fumble, Gary Danielson said the quarterback cannot make the big plays.
The quarterback. The quarterback can't make the big plays. That's the game plan for LSU.
Well, he'd have to make some here. Backed up into his own end zone, he'd find his tight end. Then they'd catch a break from a late hit out of bounds. Now at midfield, Hurts would use his legs once again on the third down scramble. We'd now head to the fourth quarter in a tie game 0-0. Hurts driving down the field. It was the first scoreless game through 3 quarters in the NCAA this season. And right out the commercial break, Bama would be met with 4th and 1. And Saban had seen enough of his kicking game in this rivalry. Hurts tossed it to the outside and Bo Scarborough picked up the first down. And now on 3rd and 9, crowd at a fever pitch, Jalen Hurts would use his legs once again, running into the end zone from 21 yards out and stunning the LSU faithful. 12 plays, 90 yards, just shy of 6 minutes. This was one of those moments where we just saw a quarterback grow up in front of our eyes. Just like when a true freshman Matt Barkley went into Columbus and led a game-winning drive. This was true freshman Jalen Hurts' moment. And his defense rewarded him by picking off Danny Etling 2 plays into the next drive. Hurts then followed it up with a 15-play, 50-yard drive for a field goal, and that 10-0 lead would be enough to win the game. Talk about iconic. This was one of those rivalry-defining moments for Alabama. Just like A.J. McCarron in 2012 in this very stadium, Jalen Hurts had done it to the Tigers again. Just 10 completions for 107 yards and an interception through the air. But his 20 rushes for 114 yards and that 1 touchdown saved the Alabama season. The schedule would lighten up with 2 blowout wins over Mississippi State where he'd throw for 347 and rush for 100 in a 51-3 win, and then Chattanooga where they won 31-3. And then it was time to buckle up once again because it was the Iron Bowl versus number 13 Auburn. And it was in this very game where Hurts would have one of his best games through the air. 286 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions, and 37 yards and a touchdown on the ground. The Tide won 30-12 in a game that was never really in question in the second half. And now time for the SEC Championship. They'd meet number 15 Florida in Atlanta. And yeah, this one was also never in doubt. A 54-16 win for the Tide. Hurts had 11 pass completions for 138 yards and a touchdown, and he was actually contained on the ground, just running for 1 yard. But the running back trio of Bo Scarborough, Damian Harris, and Josh Jacobs had picked up the load en route to the blowout win. And now it was time for the college football playoff. Number 1 Alabama would be heading back to Atlanta for a date with number 4 Washington. And yet again, the Alabama defense gets the credit for a monster performance. They held the Huskies to just 7 points. And offensively, it wasn't exactly where Alabama wanted to be. But after yielding the first touchdown, the Tide scored 24 unanswered. Bo Scarborough had 2 of the touchdowns, with one of them being a 68-yarder, and the other touchdown was a Ryan Anderson pick 6. Hurts had just 7 pass completions totaling 57 yards and 19 rushes totaling 50 yards. And he'd need much more than that in the national championship game, as it'd be a highly anticipated rematch versus the Clemson Tigers. In the Fiesta Bowl, Clemson shut out Ohio State 31-0. And in last year's national championship game, it took the Tide 45 points to prevail versus the Tigers. Relying on past history, Alabama's offensive performances wouldn't be near enough to take down Clemson this year. But yet again, they had an all-time great defense to rely on. So could they do it again in this season? Because it'd take a total team effort. And what a game this was. Probably the best college football playoff national championship game ever. Alabama's defense had their name all over the first quarter. And offensively, it was Bo Scarborough. He led the Tide to a 7-0 lead at the end of 1. And it was Scarborough again who would give the Tide a 14-0 lead. But Clemson wasn't going down without a fight. Deshaun Watson would finally get going on a monster drive to get Clemson on the board. And the rest of the quarter was a defensive affair, and we'd head to the locker room in a 14-7 ball game. And desperately needing an answer to revive a dormant offense, Hurts found a wide open O.J. Howard, and the Tide extended their lead back to 10. And as we started the fourth quarter, Clemson once again found the end zone, and we had a 24-21 ball game. And this time, Bama didn't have the answer offensively. And the Tigers took advantage, driving down the field with less than 7 to go to take their first lead of the game with just 5 minutes to go. Alabama had now been outscored 14-0 in the fourth quarter and had 5 minutes to save their season. And Hurts, just like on that night in Baton Rouge, made the plays when they needed to be made. And with a lot of deja vu, these Tigers would see Hurts scramble for a go-ahead touchdown just like the Tigers of LSU did on that November night. With just 2:07 to go, Hurts had given Alabama the lead, But the problem, there were still 2 minutes and 7 seconds for Deshaun Watson. Alabama's defense had been so great all year, but on this drive, the Clemson offense carved their way down the field, and in a cinematic ending, Renfro found the end zone with just 1 second remaining to retake the lead and win the national championship of college football. A heartbreaking ending for Jalen Hurts and the Tide. And what would sting throughout the whole offseason was getting outscored 21-7 in the fourth quarter of a 4-point loss in the national championship. That was the motivation for this team heading into 2017. But joining the team heading into 2017 was a guy named Tua Tagovailoa. And Tua from Hawaii was the Elite 11 Finals MVP and the consensus #1 dual threat quarterback in the country with the 98.247 sports rating. Also joining Alabama was 5-star Jerry Jeudy, 4-star Devontae Smith, and 4-star Henry Ruggs. A very much needed loaded wide receiver class. So here we go, sophomore year. And yet again, they had a high-profile matchup to open the season. And yet again, they dominated that matchup. This time vanquishing Florida State 24-7, in a game where Hurts only had 96 passing yards and 1 total touchdown, accompanied by his 55 rushing yards. And then the rest of the season was realistically a cakewalk. The FSU win didn't look so good after they had started the season 2-6, and Alabama wouldn't play a ranked team again until November when they met number 19 LSU. But the trend this year still, even with the lighter schedule, was a heavy dose of rushing and not so much through the air. In week 2 versus Fresno State, Hurts threw for 128 yards but ran for 154 in the 41-10 win. In week 3 versus Colorado State, Hurts threw for a season high 248 yards and rushed for 103 in the 41-23 win. In week 4 versus Vanderbilt, Hurts was actually outgained by Tua through the air. Hurts had threw for 78 yards and 0 touchdowns and also only had 48 rushing yards. Once Tua came in the third quarter of the blowout win, he threw for 103 yards and 2 touchdowns. But the offensive load was once again carried by the backs, who led them to the 59-0 win, with Damian Harris running for 151 yards and 3 touchdowns, Bo Scarborough running for 79 yards and 2 touchdowns, and Najee Harris and Brian Robinson combining for 121 yards of their own. Week 5 versus Ole Miss, they shut the door early in a dominating 66-3 win, with Hurts totaling 197 through the air and 101 on the ground. Week 6 versus A&M was actually a close game, but the Tide prevailed 27-19, with Hurts throwing for 123 yards and a touchdown and rushing for 56 and a touchdown. Then they pummeled Arkansas 41-9, with Hurts throwing for 155 yards, 1 touchdown and 1 interception, and running for 41 yards and a touchdown. So where the team was missing in the passing game, they were more than hitting in the run game, as Damian Harris continued his monster season with another multi-touchdown game. Tennessee was yet again just another monster performance for the Tide, as they'd win 45-7, and Hurts threw for 198 yards and a touchdown, but just rushed for 14 yards. And then it was time for those LSU Tigers to come to town. And this matchup didn't quite have the same drama as last year's. Alabama jumped out to a 14-0 lead in the second quarter, and by the time we were halfway through the third, it was 21-3. The final score ended up being 24-10, with Hurts completing 11 passes for 183 yards and 1 touchdown. And then on the ground, he added 44 yards and another score. And then next up was yet another ranked matchup, number 16 Mississippi State. And this one had the dramatics. In a back and forth game the entire night, Alabama found themselves trailing 24-17 in the fourth quarter. And that's when Jalen Hurts and the Alabama offense showed up. An 82-yard drive tied the game at 24. And then late in the fourth quarter, with just 1 minute left on the clock, Hurts drove 68 yards as he found Calvin Ridley and Devontae Smith in back-to-back plays, totaling over 50 yards to retake the lead, 31-24 with just 25 seconds remaining. What a drive from Jalen Hurts that boosted him to 242 passing yards, which broke a streak of 6 straight games throwing under 200. He also had 40 rushing yards on the ground and 2 total touchdowns. Next week's game was a 56-0 shutout of Mercer before the Iron Bowl. And finally, the Tide would take their first regular season loss under Jalen Hurts. The 26-14 loss was backbreaking and put them in serious jeopardy of missing the playoff, as they would not play for an SEC championship anymore. Hurts was held to 112 yards passing, 1 total touchdown, and 82 rushing yards. A dominating performance for the Auburn defense, who held Damian Harris to just 51 rushing yards and shutting them out in the fourth quarter. But luckily for Alabama, Auburn would lose to Georgia in the SEC championship, opening up Alabama's spot in the college football playoff. And they'd be facing a familiar foe in the semifinal Sugar Bowl matchup, number 1 Clemson. But Deshaun Watson wasn't on the other sideline this time, and Clemson would muster up just 6 total points with Kelly Bryant. Hurts had a pretty efficient game too, 16 for 24, 120 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 40 rushing yards. This game was definitely not on par with the 2 previous Alabama-Clemson matchups entertainment-wise, and just like that, Alabama found themselves back in the national championship after knocking out Clemson 24-6. And here's where things get real. Georgia just had an offensive explosion to outduel number 2 Oklahoma in an all-time classic Rose Bowl game. How many points did they score, you might ask? 54. So the mark was set for Alabama. Obviously their defense was much better than Oklahoma's, but with the offensive performances they've had through the air this year, they knew they'd need a lot more on this night, which was essentially a home game right in Georgia's backyard. And for Alabama, the start to this game was the exact opposite of what they needed offensively. Missed field goal, 3 and out, 3 and out, 4 and out, 3 and out, end of half. A disastrous offensive performance as Hurts had thrown just 3 pass completions for 21 yards. The Tide were held off the scoreboard, but their defense came to play. They had held Georgia to just 13 points, but 7 of them came with just 7 seconds left in the half. So it wasn't even just a momentum swing, they had captured every bit of momentum. But the game was still in reach. Would Jalen come out and bring his team back in the second half? Well, not quite. Saban had reached desperation mode, and he decided to make a massive change at quarterback. Remember that Tua Tagovailoa guy, the 5-star number 1 dual threat quarterback? Well, all of a sudden, you find yourself starting the second half in a national championship. With Tua in, the Tide were able to weather the storm a little in the third quarter. They had outscored the Bulldogs 10-7 with Tua throwing a key touchdown pass to Henry Ruggs, true freshman to true freshman. And now they'd enter the fourth quarter down 20-10, and Tua had completely brung the Tide back. The Alabama defense forced a fourth quarter shutout, which allowed Tua to calm down and tie the game at 20 with just 3:21 to go. And his defense even got him the ball back with the chance to win in regulation, but the 36-yard field goal would be missed as time expired to send us to overtime. In overtime, Bama held Georgia to a field goal, and Tua had the chance to win it. After taking what seemed to be a disastrous 16-yard sack, Tua would drop back, and once again, it was true freshman to true freshman as Tua would find Devontae Smith from 41 yards out to win the national championship. So a lot to process here. And the immediate thought after a few days had passed was would Jalen Hurts transfer, as this was obviously Tua's team now. Teams like Texas were on the radar as it was a massive program from Hurts' hometown. But nope, he'd stay right in Tuscaloosa. Saban had brung in quarterbacks coach Dan Enos, and his attempts to get Jalen to stay and develop as a passer worked. So Alabama was now the clear favorite for the national title with an elite quarterback room of Tua and Hurts and an embarrassment of riches at receiver. So on to 2018. With Tua as quarterback 1, the Tide had one of the most impressive seasons we've ever seen. Monster numbers offensively every week, and Alabama literally was not challenged a single time in the regular season. Going were the days of Greg McElroy or John Parker Wilson, this was officially a pass-first team. Alabama in this season had scored 51, 57, 62, 45, 56, 65, 39, 58, 29, 24, 50, and 52 points. Tua had 4 games of 300 and more yards and finished second in the Heisman to Kyler Murray. And to be honest, he probably would have won it if not for this reason right here. Going into the SEC championship, he only played in 1 fourth quarter. 1. But the person this helped more than anyone was Jalen Hurts. He played in every single fourth quarter, and this allowed him to develop in real game action. And then it was time for the SEC championship, a much anticipated rematch versus Georgia. And yeah, things went off the rails very quick. Tua had suffered a high ankle sprain on the 4th play of the game, and Tua would try to gut it out, but this obviously wasn't the same Tua. Through 3 quarters and some change, he had just 164 yards passing for 1 touchdown and 2 interceptions. And then he'd go down for good in this game, injuring his ankle even more. Tua was carted off the field, and with 11:15 to go in the 4th quarter, just like in a movie script, it'd be Jalen Hurts coming into the game for an injured Tua, with a shot at revenge against the same team he was pulled against 11 months ago, in the very same stadium he was pulled in 11 months ago. You couldn't even write a script this good. And now it was a refined Jalen Hurts after nearly a year of working with Dan Enos and getting multiple valuable snaps in the 4th quarter of games throughout the year. A massive opportunity had presented itself, but now could he take advantage of it? Well, he did exactly that. He took the field with his team down 21-14 and capped off a 16-play 80-yard drive with a 10-yard touchdown pass to Jerry Jeudy to tie it at 28. Then the defense did their job, and Jalen Hurts got the ball back with 2:59 to go and a shot at redemption. And once again, he drive right down the field, and in signature Jalen Hurts fashion, he killed them with a dagger rushing touchdown from 15 yards out to take a 35-28 lead with just over a minute to go. Jalen Hurts had done it. He waited his turn, and after a year of development, he showed why he can lead a program, coming back into the SEC championship and completely flipping the switch. He went 7 for 9 for 82 yards and a touchdown, and on the ground he ran for 28 yards, which included the game-winning touchdown. What a story. After the SEC title, Tua would be back, and they dominated the Heisman Trophy winner Kyler Murray in Oklahoma. Yes, the final score was 45-34, but it was 31-10 and 45-27 at multiple points throughout the game. The final score was never in doubt. So now it's time for the national championship, which was once again versus Clemson. And this time it'd be Dabo and the Tigers coming for vengeance. Just like how Alabama used true freshman to true freshman last year versus Georgia, it was Clemson using true freshman to true freshman when Trevor Lawrence and Justin Ross dispatched of the Tide 44-16 to reclaim the national championship. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as less than 3% of you guys are subscribed. Back to the video. And that was it for Jalen Hurts' chapter at Alabama, and the perfect opportunity immediately opened up for Jalen. His next chapter would be at Oklahoma with Lincoln Riley to fill the void of Kyler Murray, who had just went to the draft. Lincoln was the perfect coach for Jalen. Lincoln's track record was Heisman Trophy winner Baker Mayfield in 2017 and Heisman Trophy winner Kyler Murray in 2018. There wasn't a single coach better equipped in the country for Jalen Hurts, and it was the perfect match. Jalen would also have future first-round wide receiver CeeDee Lamb out wide to throw to. And in Hurts' first game as an Oklahoma Sooner, he'd throw for 322 yards and 3 touchdowns, accompanied by 176 rushing yards, and again, 3 touchdowns. So 6 total touchdowns in a 49-31 win versus the Houston Cougars, and already Lincoln Riley had worked with Jalen to have the best game of his career so far. The next week versus South Dakota, it'd be a 259-yard and 3 touchdown passing performance, accompanied by 47 rushing yards and a 70-point performance where Jalen didn't play a single second of the 4th quarter. And the high numbers would keep on coming for Jalen. The next week versus UCLA, he had 289 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 150 rushing yards and 1 rushing touchdown in the 48-14 win. This is a totally different Jalen Hurts than the one we saw starting for Alabama, and him waiting it out an extra year in Tuscaloosa instead of making an immediate transfer to who knows where was paying major dividends. Then versus Texas Tech, he'd have his first game of over 400 yards passing as he racked up 415 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, just 1 interception, and 70 rushing yards with another rushing touchdown. Jaden was totally looking like he'd have a great shot at continuing Lincoln Riley's Heisman streak with these performances. Then versus Kansas, it was once again a great showing. His passing yards had dropped to 228, but he still had 2 passing touchdowns, just 1 interception, and 56 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. It was more than enough as they won 45-20. And then it was time for what is usually the craziest game of the year, the Red River rivalry game. And remember last year, it was Texas who handed the Sooners their lone regular season loss, but Hurts wouldn't let that happen this year. once again over 300 total yards as he threw for 235 yards, 3 touchdowns, just 1 interception, and then ran for 131 yards and 1 touchdown. Hurts always had amazing rushing ability at Alabama, but now pairing that with this cool, calm, and poised passing attack was a lethal threat as shown in this 34-27 win. After the high of beating Texas, the winning would continue as Hurts had his 3rd game of the season throwing for over 300 yards, as he totaled for 316 passing yards and 3 touchdowns on just 1 singular incompletion, which was also accompanied by 75 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And then came their first loss of the year, a close, thrilling 48-41 loss to Kansas State, where Hurts had 395 passing yards and a touchdown, and then 96 rushing yards for 3 total touchdowns. Finally, Oklahoma's defense was showing cracks, but the story here is Jalen Hurts more than did his job. Then they'd bounce back with a too close for comfort victory over Iowa State in a 42-41 win. Jalen Hurts still showed out with 273 passing yards for 3 touchdowns to just 1 interception, and still ran for 2 more touchdowns and 68 rushing yards. By this point of the season, the Sooners were 8-1, and it was just survive and advance. The defense was starting to disappear, but Jalen Hurts was doing more than enough to win games. And that'd be on display once again as they'd beat number 13 Baylor 34-31. This one wasn't a back and forth game though. Baylor actually jumped out to a 28-3 lead, which became 31-10 at halftime. But the Sooners showed no quit as Hurts led the comeback, winning 34-31 with the game-winning field goal. And shout out to the defense who pitched a second-half shutout. Hurts finished with 297 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, 1 interception, and 114 rushing yards. The next week versus TCU was once again another close win as they'd hold off a TCU comeback in a 28-24 win to clinch a Big 12 title spot. Hurts had just 145 yards passing with 2 touchdowns and 1 interception, but a monster day on the ground with 173 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns was enough. Then it was time for Bedlam versus number 21 Oklahoma State. And Hurts wouldn't have his best performance with just 163 passing yards and 1 touchdown, and then on the ground 61 rushing yards and a touchdown. But a monster day from Kennedy Brooks totaling 160 rushing yards and a score was more than enough for a 34-16 victory. And now it was time for the Big 12 title game versus Baylor. If you win, you're in the playoff. So with everything on the line for the Sooners, a back and forth affair ended up going to overtime tied at 23. And that's where Hurts found Ramondre Stevenson for 6. The OU defense got the stop, and it was a 30-23 win for the Sooners, with Hurts compiling 287 passing yards, 1 touchdown, and 38 rushing yards to win the Big 12 in his home state in one of the all-time great comeback stories. And more importantly, Oklahoma had punched their ticket to the Peach Bowl and the college football playoff. Hurts would also finish 2nd in the Heisman voting, finishing behind Joe Burrow, the same quarterback he'd be facing off against next. It was LSU and Oklahoma in the Peach Bowl for a trip to the national championship. And yeah, this one was an absolute mauling. The LSU Tigers won 63-28 with Joe Burrow compiling 8 total touchdowns, 7 of them coming in the first half. So this one was never in doubt, and Hurts was held to 217 yards passing, 0 touchdowns, and 1 interception. But he still had 2 rushing touchdowns and a 43-yard rushing performance. But the LSU gauntlet was just too overpowering during their undefeated 2019 season, and that Peach Bowl would signal an end to Jalen Hurts' collegiate career. And what a run it was for him in college, so much compacted in just 4 short years. From becoming a starter as a true freshman, losing a heartbreaker in the final seconds of the national championship, then getting back to that game a year later and getting benched as Tua led a comeback to win it all, then waiting it out and developing at Bama to have a shot at revenge 11 months later against Georgia in the SEC championship, to then transfer to Oklahoma for your senior year and having a monster season and coming 2nd in Heisman voting. In his 2 years as a starter at Bama, he had 2,780 yards and 2,081 yards respectively through the air. In his 1 year at Oklahoma, that jumped up to 3,851 yards passing, not to mention his rushing high at Bama was 954 yards. At Oklahoma, he ran for 1,298 yards. What happened to Hurts in that national championship might have broken a lot of other players. But Hurts took it as an opportunity to get better, and he reinvented himself in those next 2 years and was now in great position heading into the NFL draft. Jalen Hurts' scouting report heading into the draft by Charlie Campbell was his strengths were he's tough, takes hits and doesn't get hurt, durable, and a winner. His weaknesses were he's a very limited passer, struggles to see the field, poor vision, struggles to read defenses, slow to work through progressions, not an accurate passer, one-read quarterback, arm strength very average, and has personality issues. According to the NFL mock draft database, he was projected to go 3rd round with the 72nd overall pick. On the official NFL site, Hurts was labeled with a 6.14 prospect grade, titled as a good backup with potential to develop into a starter. And Lance Zierlein's NFL comparison was Tim Tebow, a winning dual-threat quarterback known for his strength, toughness, and character, but has issues sustaining rhythm as a passer with so many off-schedule throws, inconsistent patience allowing routes to develop, leaves slants and crossers behind targets, misses checkdowns and opts for harder throws, and forced speedsters at Oklahoma and Alabama to slow down for deep throws. All of this information is important because you can imagine the shock on everyone's face when the Philadelphia Eagles took Jalen Hurts with the 53rd overall pick. CBS Sports HQ immediately gave the pick a C- grade. So what exactly made this pick so bad? Well, the Philadelphia Eagles already had their franchise quarterback in Carson Wentz. Wentz was his 2nd overall pick in the 2016 draft, and in his 2nd season being 2017, he was the MVP frontrunner until his season-ending ACL injury. After that injury, backup Nick Foles would come in and lead the team to a victory over the New England Patriots in Super Bowl LII. 2018 was then supposed to be Wentz's bounce back year. He came back after the first 2 games rehabbing his knee, and things just weren't the same. But the team was still in the playoff race, and well, in week 14, he'd go down with a back injury versus Dallas and he was shut down for the season. And yet again, it'd be Foles taking over and leading them to the playoffs. But then the Eagles would move on from Foles, solidifying Wentz as a franchise quarterback. And that'd be followed up with the Eagles making Wentz the highest paid player in NFL history. And then Wentz would actually play an entire season. In 2019, he threw for 4K yards, 27 touchdowns, just 7 interceptions, and in his final 5 games of the year, he completed 66% of his passes, 10 touchdowns to just 1 interception, and the Eagles went 4-1 en route to the NFC East Championship. Everything was looking up, and Wentz was finally returning to form. And then, in the wildcard game versus Seahawks, Jadeveon Clowney would dive into Wentz, crashing into his head and giving him a concussion that knocked him out of the game in the Eagles' 17-9 loss. This was now the 3rd consecutive season Wentz finished with an injury, but sadly, the last one wasn't even his body breaking down. He just took an unfortunate hit to the head. And then in the offseason, the moment happened.
The Philadelphia Eagles select Jalen Hurts.
Shockingly, just 11 months after signing Wentz to a record-setting contract, the Eagles would use their 2nd-round draft pick on Jalen Hurts. And there wouldn't even be a quarterback controversy heading into the season, which made it that much more controversial. A team that had a lot of needs used their 2nd-round pick on a quarterback that was graded as a projected 72nd overall pick who had many weaknesses throwing the ball. But maybe all along the Eagles just knew internally what Carson Wentz really was. And as we got into the 2020 season, Wentz wasn't just bad, he was bottom of the league bad. After 32 qualified quarterbacks in passing statistics through 13 weeks, Wentz ranked 31st in completion percentage with 57.4%, 29th in interception completion percentage at 3.4%, 30th in yards per attempt with 6 yards per attempt, and 30th in quarterback rating with a 72.8. The Eagles' offensive line didn't help as Wentz was sacked a league-high 50 times, or 10.3% on dropback attempts. The Eagles were 3-8-1 in Wentz's 12 starts. So then, the moment would happen. In Week 13 against the Green Bay Packers, Wentz would go 6 for 15 for 79 yards through 2.5 quarters, and the Eagles would officially make the move to bench Carson Wentz for Jalen Hurts. After all the talk about how bad the draft pick was and why Carson Wentz was the guy, the quarterback 1 job now belonged to Jalen Hurts just 13 games through the year. The Eagles had just 3 points when Hurts took the field, but with Hurts in, he sparked the Eagles offense, throwing his first career touchdown and finishing with 109 passing yards and 29 rushing yards, but also had an interception. But all that mattered was the Eagles had seemed to found a spark with the rookie, and that continued when they'd snapped their 4-game losing streak by beating the New Orleans Saints 24-21. It wasn't Hurts' best game passing as he went 17 for 30 for 167 yards, 1 touchdown, and no interception. But rushing, he ran for 106 yards on 18 carries. And then it all started to click. Despite losing 33-26 to the Cardinals the next week, he threw for 338 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions, and also added 63 yards on the ground with a touchdown. Unfortunately for Jalen Hurts, also former Oklahoma Sooner Kyler Murray threw for a career-high 406 yards in their victory. Hurts had now become the first player in the past 70 years to have 500-plus passing yards and 150-plus rushing yards in his first 2 career starts, as he completed 41 of 74 passes for 505 yards with 4 touchdowns and 0 interceptions, while rushing 29 times for 169 yards and a 94.7 passer rating. Wentz's future with the Eagles was now in serious jeopardy, and the Eagles draft pick was looking to be a steal. The next week versus Dallas, he had yet another 300-yard game with 342 passing yards, but he only threw 1 touchdown and was intercepted twice, and he was held to 69 rushing yards in a 37-17 loss. And now it was time for the final game of the season, Sunday Night Football versus the Washington football team. If Washington wins, they win the division. If Washington loses, the Giants win the division. And this went on to maybe be the funniest game of all time. The 2020 NFC East was one of the worst divisions of all time, and here we are at the final game of the season where the Giants are 6-10, yet with a Washington loss, they'd win the division. And for 3 quarters, it looked like that would be a very real possibility. The Washington offense was stagnant with an Alex Smith who courageously returned from a broken leg, and Hurts wasn't having his best day at the office, but his dual threat ability was keeping Washington on their toes. And then the moment happened. It was a 17-14 game, and the Eagles would bench Jalen Hurts for Nate Sudfeld, and it took just 3 plays for Sudfeld to throw a massive interception. But Washington did nothing with the ball. But don't you worry, Sudfeld would fumble the ball just 2 plays into the next drive. Washington would hit a field goal to extend the lead to 20-14, and after trading punts, the game was over. The Eagles had successfully completed the most obvious tank we'd ever seen on national television and sent Giants Twitter into a rant, with many of the team's biggest names crying about the Eagles' decision to pull Hurts. But all that mattered for Philly was they set themselves up handsomely for the upcoming draft. But before we get to the draft, the Eagles would make the decision to fire Doug Peterson, a tough decision as he delivered the team's first and only Super Bowl, but the unwillingness to hire an offensive coordinator after a putrid offensive showing did him in. The Week 17 loss led to the Eagles picking 6th overall, which they used to trade to the Dolphins, and now they'd pick 12th in the 2021 draft and add an additional first-round pick in the 2022 draft. They then send that 12th pick in a 3rd rounder to Dallas, and that led to them selecting the reigning Heisman Trophy winner Devontae Smith out of Alabama, just 1 pick before the Giants could at 11. How fitting that once again it'd be Jalen Hurts and Devontae Smith on the same team. But they weren't done. They also traded Carson Wentz to the Indianapolis Colts, reuniting him with Frank Reich and essentially stealing yet another first-round pick for the next year's draft. So now we get to 2021, and not spending too much time with this season, the team made massive improvements. They had started 3-6 and seemed on pace for last year's finish, but then won 6 of their last 8 games, finishing 9-8 and making the playoffs where they'd get routed by the defending champion Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Tom Brady. But confidence was surely gained in that final stretch in the playoff game. Versus Tampa, despite starting down 31-0, Hurts still gained valuable playoff experience that'd be key for next year as he threw for 258 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions, and added just 39 yards on the ground. But he started in every meaningful game this year and compiled 3,144 passing yards, while also leading the team in rushing with 784 rushing yards and had just 16 passing touchdowns to 9 interceptions, but found the end zone 10 times on the ground. Also, the Bama to Bama connection led to Devontae Smith leading the team in receiving yards with 916, but it was obvious they still needed more outside, and Howie Roseman was currently developing a masterclass behind the scenes. Now we get to the 2022 draft, and remember, the Eagles had 2 first-round picks, so they traded up from 15th to 13th to draft Jordan Davis, and then with the 18th pick, they'd make a blockbuster trade to send that pick to the Tennessee Titans for disgruntled star wide receiver A.J. Brown. A franchise-changing trade had now made the Philadelphia Eagles legit contenders with A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith in the receiving room. The Eagles went into the draft with 10 picks, and now they only had 6. But those 6 picks would be Jordan Davis, Cam Jurgens, Jacoby Dean, Kyron Johnson, and Grant Calcaterra. But those first 3 picks were massive coming in a draft where they also acquired A.J. Brown. And as for Carson Wentz, he'd be traded to the newly named Washington Commanders after just 1 season in Indy. And spoiler, he'd played just 8 games in Washington. So now we move to the 2022 season, and there's nothing to say outside of straight dominance. Hurts had arrived as his confidence was showing in his team's 8-0 start to the year. And in 2 of the team's first 3 games, Hurts had thrown for 333 and 340 yards respectively. Week 1 was a 38-35 win versus the Lions, with Hurts throwing for 243 yards. Week 2 was a 24-7 win over the Vikings, with Hurts throwing for 333 yards. Week 3 was a 24-8 win over the Washington Commanders, with Hurts throwing for 340 yards. Week 4 was a 29-21 win versus Jags, with Hurts throwing for 204 yards. Week 5 was a 20-17 win versus the Cardinals, throwing for 239 yards. And then in Week 6, the massive game versus the 4-1 Dallas Cowboys, who were albeit missing Dak Prescott. Hurts would throw for 155 in the 26-17 win. Then they'd have the bye week, and coming out of the bye was a huge 285-yard passing performance in the 35-13 win in the Battle of Pennsylvania versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Then in Week 8, he'd followed up with a 243-yard performance in a 29-17 win versus the Texans. But versus the Washington Commanders, the undefeated season would come to an end, as Taylor Heinicke and his 211 passing yards would be enough to outduel Jalen Hurts, who just threw for 175 passing yards and was held to 28 yards on the ground. But they then followed the loss with a 5-game winning streak, knocking off the Colts in a grinded-out 17-16 win with 190 passing yards, outdueling Aaron Rodgers and the Packers in a 40-33 win with just 153 passing yards but 157 rushing yards, then throwing for 380 yards in a 35-10 revenge win for A.J. Brown versus Titans, who racked up 119 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. Next up in the schedule was an easy 48-22 win over the Giants, with Hurts throwing for 217, and then a 25-20 win versus Chicago Bears, with Hurts throwing for 315 yards. But in that victory over the Chicago Bears, Jalen would suffer a sprained shoulder in his throwing arm that knocked him out the next 2 games, and most importantly, one of those games was versus the Dallas Cowboys. And with Gardner Minshew, the Eagles would lose 40-34 on Sunday Night Football to the Cowboys. This would be the Eagles' second loss of the year, dropping them to 13-2, and then they'd lose a second straight game in a 20-10 loss to the New Orleans Saints. And the Eagles, who were 13-1 when Hurts got hurt, were now 13-3. Luckily, Jalen would come back for the Week 18 game versus the New York Giants, and this was a grinded-out gritty game, but the Eagles would prevail 22-16, with Hurts throwing for 229 yards in his return. And now the Eagles, sitting at 14-3, they'd enter the playoff as the NFC East champion and secure the NFC's #1 seed. After the bye week, their divisional round opponent would be yet another matchup with the New York Giants, and this time it wouldn't even be close. A 38-7 victory in the game where Hurts threw just 154 yards would send the Eagles to the NFC Championship for a date with the 49ers. The 49ers in the previous year came just short of making the Super Bowl and were looking to right that wrong here, but that wouldn't happen. This was a dominant performance by the Eagles defense in a 31-7 win where they knocked Brock Purdy out the game just one drive in, tearing his UCL. And it seemed Josh Johnson would play the rest of the NFC Championship game, but then Josh Johnson would suffer a concussion just minutes into the third quarter, and then once again Purdy would return. But he was extremely limited and couldn't even complete a forward pass, and he finished the game with just 23 passing yards. Hurts had an easy day at the office, completing just 15 passes for 121 yards and only rushing for 39 yards. But it didn't matter, because after 2 wins holding both opponents to just 7 points, the Eagles were headed back to the Super Bowl. Their opponent would be the Kansas City Chiefs, who narrowly defeated the Cincinnati Bengals in the AFC Championship, vanquishing the Burrowhead nickname, and we'd have Mahomes looking for his second Super Bowl. And just like those Clemson games in college for Hurts, he knew he'd need a better offensive performance than normal to win the big one. And to Hurts' credit, he put on one of the greatest offensive performances we've ever seen in a Super Bowl. He outdueled Patrick Mahomes, throwing for 304 yards and a touchdown while adding 70 yards rushing and 3 touchdowns on the ground. Mahomes was hobbled with a knee and was also facing a 10-point deficit coming out of halftime, signature for the Chiefs, but Mahomes responded in not how he normally responds with his arm. He used his legs when they had to have it, and despite just 182 total yards passing, he threw for 3 touchdowns and let the second half come back, taking a 3-point lead with just 8 seconds remaining. And Hurts' desperation heave would fall short, and after an iconic Super Bowl performance, the Eagles would fall 38-35 to the Kansas City Chiefs. Yet again, a heartbreaker for Jalen Hurts, a loss strikingly similar to the 2017 National Championship game against Clemson, but once again, he'd use it as motivation and a vow to never let this happen again, even making the picture of him leaving the field with the confetti falling on his shoulders and his head down his phone wallpaper, a moment he'd never forget. But before we get to the 2023 season, the Eagles somehow, because of their trades in the previous years while also trading their 10th pick this year to Chicago to pick 9th, were able to land Jalen Carter out of Georgia, who would fall to them because of an off-the-field incident. And then they'd use their 30th pick in the first round to select Nolan Smith, also out of Georgia. And remember, they drafted Jordan Davis last year, and then to solidify the Eagles as the Georgia Bulldogs of the North, they'd select Kelee Ringo with their 5th round pick, who was the cornerback who sailed the national championship victory over Alabama. Safe to say, the blueprint was there. The Georgia defense had won back-to-back national championships, and they had put together one of the all-time great defensive seasons we'd ever seen. So drafting the main contributors on that defense guaranteed you elite defensive production. Not to mention, they still had Brandon Graham, Josh Sweat, and Fletcher Cox. This was just a case of the rich getting richer. So now the revenge tour was underway, and to say the beginning to this season was dominance would be an understatement. Just like last year, they didn't know how to lose. They started the season 5-0 with wins over the Patriots, Vikings, Bucks, Commanders, and Rams. In that stretch, Hurts also had 2 games of over 300 yards passing. But the loss would come to the New York Jets, who staged a game-winning drive after a second-half shutout, coming back from down 14-3 and 14-9 at half to win 20-14. After that loss, they had yet another one-score victory over the Commanders in a 38-31 win to go 6-1, and then beat the Dolphins 31-17 to go 7-1. And now it was time for their true test of the year, versus Dallas on November 5th, bye week, then at Kansas City in a Super Bowl rematch on November 20th, then versus Buffalo on November 26th, then versus San Francisco on December 3rd, and then at Dallas on December 10th. An absurd stretch of the league's top teams, 5 straight games versus playoff teams, and a stretch that would make or break the season, and it most definitely broke their season. They actually started the stretch well, winning the first 3, a 28-23 win versus Dallas, a 21-17 classic win versus Kansas City, and then in my opinion, the best game of the year when they outdueled Buffalo 37-34 in overtime. The Eagles now sat at 10-1, but then the cracks started to form and the Eagles wilted under the heavy schedule. The 49ers ransacked the Eagles 42-19 in week 13. Then in week 14, the Cowboys got revenge 33-13 in Arlington. And to make things even worse, a sneaky Seahawks team took them down 20-17 in week 15 to advance to 7-7. So now the Eagles had lost their last 3 games, and they notched their final win of the season in week 16 versus the Giants, because the 3-12 Cardinals would escape with a 35-31 win in week 17. And then week 18 resting starters, the Giants would avenge their loss in a 27-10 win. So the Eagles, who had started the season 10-1, were limping into the playoffs after finishing their season losing 5 of their last 6 and held an 11-6 record. And we all know how strong momentum is, and the Eagles had none of it in their wildcard game versus the Buccaneers. The same Bucks who they beat 25-11 in week 3 would absolutely maul the Eagles 32-9 in the wildcard game. An unfathomable ending to such a promising season. This team seemed at least NFC Championship bound again. But then came the mid-season collapse, and they found themselves watching from home as divisional weekend took place. Changes seemed to be on the horizon with Nick Sirianni on the hot seat, but they decided to retain him after 2 heartbreaking endings. We'd now see if they could put it all together for a Super Bowl run. The offseason would see Howie Roseman pull his strings again, and one of the biggest free agency moves of all time, we'd see the Eagles sign Saquon Barkley to a 3-year, $37 million contract, just stealing him from the division rival New York Giants. The Eagles now had an offensive super team of A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, and Saquon Barkley at the skill positions for Hurts to hand off and throw to. The offense was officially set, and the defense would get a massive boost too with the additions of Zach Bond and C.J. Gardner-Johnson in free agency and Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean in the first 2 rounds of the draft. The Eagles had a roster that officially looked like a Super Bowl team, but could that Super Bowl team go all the way to the big game? Well, in the beginning, it looked like they might not even win a playoff game. In week 1 overseas, they'd escaped the Packers 34-29, but in the following week on Monday Night Football, a putrid offensive performance allowed Kirk Cousins to lead a game-winning drive in the link for the Falcons' 22-21 upset of the Eagles. And things didn't get much better the next week. They had 0 points through 3 quarters and just 7 points through 90% of the game before leading a game-winning drive to escape the Saints 15-12 after a go-ahead touchdown with 1 minute to go. And then the dam broke. they'd get demolished by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The final score was 33-16, but they were once down 24-0 just midway through the third quarter. So now sitting at 2-2, miraculously, the Eagles would have their bye week. And after that bye week, it was rather smooth sailing from that point on. The way the Eagles started these two previous seasons, they'd finish this one the same way. They came out the bye week with a 20-16 win, then beat the Giants 28-3 in a game all about Saquon Barkley. Next up was a 37-17 win over the Bengals, and then a 28-23 win over the Jaguars. And then versus a falling Dallas Cowboys team, they'd crush them 34-6. They now had a nice 5-game win streak heading into Thursday Night Football versus the Commanders, who were suddenly good thanks to Jaden Daniels and Dan Quinn. But with Daniels still suffering from injured ribs, the Eagles would walk away with a grinded out 26-18 victory. After that, the winning would continue. A 37-20 win versus the Rams, a 24-19 win versus the Ravens, a 22-16 win versus the Panthers, and then a 27-13 win versus the Steelers. And then the season would come to a screeching halt, as in the rematch versus the Commanders, Jalen Hurts would go down with a concussion, and with a healthy Jaden Daniels, the Commanders would take advantage and outduel backup quarterback Kenny Pickett 36-33 and hand the Eagles their first loss since week 4. Now without Hurts for the rest of the regular season, the quarterback duo of Pickett and Tanner McKee would win the remaining 2 games versus Dallas and New York to finish as the NFC's number 2 seed right behind Detroit and a 14-3 record. Hurts would be back for the wild card, and the monstrous Eagles defense would shut down Jordan Love and the Packers as the Eagles would win 22-10 with Hurts just throwing for 131 yards. Then in the divisional, the Rams would push the Eagles to the brink of elimination in the Snow Globe. A classic football game saw Saquon Barkley bail the Eagles offense out with 2 touchdowns of 60+ yards, the second being 78 yards, and a 205-yard rushing performance as the defense held on the final drive for a 28-24 win. Also the day before, the Commanders would upset the number 1 seed Lions in an incredible offensive showing, 45-31 to advance to the NFC Championship game and set up the rematch. The Commanders were the only team to beat the Eagles after the bye week, but Jalen Hurts wasn't taking the snaps on that day. Now he's back, and to say a blowout took place here would be an understatement. Saquon Barkley once again put up a monster performance. He had 3 touchdowns in the Eagles' 55-23 win, and the Eagles once again were headed back to the Super Bowl, and they'd be facing once again the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs are now coming off back-to-back Super Bowls, looking for a 3rd straight, something that has never been done before. In their way was the Eagles, who most would say had the better team. In Mahomes' case, this season was doing more with less. Rashee Rice was out for the year, Kelsey had taken a noticeable dip, D-Hop wasn't the same player he used to be, and McCole Hardman was out for the year. But the saying was, you couldn't bet against Mahomes. But the Eagles super team didn't care about any of that. All year the sayings were Hurts wasn't a top quarterback and he'd been carried by his elite offense. And for Hurts, he heard these talks his whole career. But this game right here was a shot at redemption. Not just against the Chiefs for the events of 2 years ago, but for all the naysayers who said he can't do it. Revenge for the national championship loss against Clemson. Revenge for being pulled in a national championship game against Georgia. This Super Bowl was a chance at righting all his wrongs. And well, that's exactly what he did.
Looking to run some clock, or maybe throw the dagger. Hurts going deep for it all. Devontae Smith! He has got it! Touchdown!
One of the most dominant Super Bowl performances we'd ever seen, leaving absolutely zero doubt. The Eagles jumped to a 24-0 lead at halftime. And then with talks of if Mahomes could have his own 28-3 moment, well, the Eagles immediately slammed that door shut too. They took a 34-0 lead and the game was all but over. After starters were pulled, the Chiefs would make the score more respectable with a 40-22 final. But once again, all that mattered was Hurts outplayed Mahomes for a 2nd time in the Super Bowl. And this time they got the job done in convincing fashion at that. Hurts distributed the wealth well. He found A.J. Brown for a touchdown, he rushed for 72 yards and a touchdown, and he stuck the dagger in the Chiefs, finding his former Alabama teammate Devontae Smith for a touchdown. It was an all-around amazing performance for the Eagles as their defense had Mahomes under duress all night, despite just rushing for the entire game. By speeding up Mahomes' processing, he was picked twice, with one of those being a pick 6 by the rookie Cooper DeJean. And best of all for Hurts, it wasn't Saquon Barkley who carried the load offensively tonight. Barkley just rushed for 57 yards on 25 carries. It was Hurts' arm and leg that was moving the chains offensively as he went 17 for 22 for 221 yards and 2 touchdowns to just 1 interception. Jalen Hurts had finally silenced his doubters by winning on the biggest stage, and in process completing one of the greatest revenge stories we've ever seen. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts and opinions, and check out what happened to every preseason #1 ranked team in college football this century.